Have you ever felt absolutely sure, and later discovered how wrong you were? What if that certainty wasn't clarity, but fear in disguise? We laugh at the man who rubbed lemon juice on his face to become invisible. But what if we've all done the same, just less visibly? In a world that rewards confidence, we often mistake loudness for truth. But the real danger isn't ignorance. It's not knowing that we're ignorant. So the question isn't, are you right? The question is, do you even know what you don't know? There's a strange comfort in being sure, a quiet sense of control, of knowing where you stand. But how many of our certainties are actually shields? Not wisdom, but weapons we use to protect ourselves from the terror of being wrong. Think of a moment in your life when you were absolutely convinced about a person, a belief, a decision. You defended it, maybe even shaped your identity around it. And then something cracked. The evidence, the experience, the silence. Something came, and it didn't ask your permission to rewrite the truth. It's disorienting, isn't it? Like realizing you've been walking confidently in the wrong direction. Your pride doesn't want to turn back, but your soul knows you must. So you pause. You stare into the unknown. And in that silence, something rare begins to form. Self-awareness. Now, imagine a man walks into a bank in broad daylight, his face smeared with lemon juice. He's convinced, utterly convinced, that he's invisible to security cameras. He robs 2 banks and walks out smiling. When the police later show him the footage, he's stunned. "But I wore the juice," he says, genuinely baffled. This isn't just stupidity, it's a mirror. Because the human mind has a blind spot that's both tragic and universal. We don't know what we don't know. This phenomenon was named by psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger, who discovered a cruel paradox. Those who lack competence are often the most confident in their abilities. And those with deep knowledge, they tend to doubt themselves. The danger isn't ignorance, it's invisible ignorance. The man with the lemon juice isn't dangerous because he's uninformed. He's dangerous because he thinks he's informed. And in a culture that equates confidence with intelligence, this illusion becomes contagious. We live in a time where the loudest person in the room is often mistaken for the wisest. Where social media platforms reward quick takes over quiet reflection. Where complexity is flattened into clickbait certainty. Our screens are full of people who say, "Trust me," but rarely say, "I could be wrong." But beneath all this noise, there's something tender and terrifying. The human desire to be right. Not because we're arrogant, but because being wrong feels like a kind of death. It threatens the stories we've told ourselves about who we are and what we understand. Certainty becomes a survival strategy, and so we armor ourselves with confidence. We cling to strong opinions, even if they're built on weak foundations. But here's the truth. Real wisdom doesn't roar. It hesitates, questions. It sits with discomfort. The philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt." That's not an insult, it's a diagnosis. This video isn't about laughing at those who know less. It's about recognizing how easily we all fall into the trap. It's about the courage to say, "I don't know," and mean it, not as a weakness, but as the beginning of real knowledge. Because if we're brave enough to admit we've worn the lemon juice too, then maybe, just maybe, we're finally ready to start seeing. There's a moment, often silent and unnoticed, when confidence becomes a costume. You might not feel it happening, but you've likely lived it. Someone asks a question. You don't really know the answer, but instead of admitting it, you answer anyway, firmly, maybe even passionately. Why? Because somewhere along the line, we learned that saying, "I don't know," is a threat. To our image, to our value, to the roles we've been trained to play. Certainty in our culture has become a kind of currency. It buys approval, authority, power, and most dangerously, identity. Many of us grew up equating knowledge with worth. Being right wasn't just about the answer. It was about being seen, being respected, being loved. So we performed clarity even when we felt confusion. We smiled and nodded, even when the topic floated just above our reach. We echoed opinions that sounded smart, even if we hadn't lived them. This is the invisible cost of certainty, the quiet abandonment of curiosity, the loss of honest questions, the shrinking of our own intellectual humility. Over time, this becomes a habit. We mistake performance for understanding. We learn to speak louder, not deeper, to sound certain, not to seek truth. We build mental habits around self-protection rather than self-inquiry. And we forget the difference. But this confidence has a price. It isolates. When we pretend to know, we stop learning. When we talk to be right, we forget to listen. When we defend an idea out of pride, we lose the chance to evolve. You see it in conversations where no one really hears the other. In debates where the goal isn't growth, but dominance. In families, where a parent's authority crushes a child's curiosity. In workplaces, where asking a question feels like a confession of incompetence. The pressure to appear sure becomes more important than the pursuit of understanding. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "It is impossible to begin to learn that which one thinks one already knows." That line should echo inside us because it reveals a tragedy, that much of our potential is suffocated by the fear of seeming lost. And so, paradoxically, the more we fake certainty, the further we drift from real knowledge. Ironically, we often become most defensive when we're secretly unsure. That's the ego's whisper, "Don't show weakness." So we double down. We raise our voices. We retreat into certainty, not because we know, but because we're terrified we don't. And in that moment, something breaks. Not just connection with others, but connection with ourselves. We become actors in our own minds, afraid to meet the unknown with honesty, afraid to admit to ourselves above all that we might be wrong. But what if certainty isn't strength? What if true confidence looks more like openness than control? What if wisdom begins not in knowing, but in the courage to ask, "Could I be wrong?" Because when we start asking that question, not to doubt ourselves destructively, but to understand ourselves honestly, we open the door to something rare in this world. Real learning, real connection, and maybe real peace. There's a strange phenomenon that happens in the mind. The less we know, the more convinced we are that we know enough. Sounds absurd, but it's deeply human. Psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger put words to this invisible trap. In their research, they found that people with the lowest ability in a given area often rated themselves among the best. They didn't just perform poorly, they were unaware of how poorly they performed. That's the heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The ignorance that doesn't know it's ignorant. This isn't just a flaw in others. It's something all of us carry in different areas at different times. You can be drowning in confusion and still feel like you're swimming, simply because you've never seen the ocean. Without the contrast of deep knowledge, we mistake our shallow understanding for depth. Imagine trying to judge a symphony when you've only ever heard one instrument, or thinking you've mastered a language after memorizing 10 phrases. When you know very little, you lack the tools to even measure how little you know. This creates a double blindness. Not only are you wrong, you're wrong about being wrong. That's what makes this effect so dangerous. It isn't arrogance in the traditional sense. It's a kind of psychological blindness, a metacognitive failure, the inability to think about our own thinking. The mind lacks the mirrors it needs to see itself clearly. This is why people can be so loudly wrong, so confidently mistaken. It's not always about ego. Often it's about structure, the way the brain builds meaning with limited information. We fill in the blanks. We construct narratives. And if those narratives are never challenged, they become our truths. You see this everywhere. The person who becomes a political expert after scrolling through headlines. The friend who offers parenting advice without children of their own. The online guru who's read 2 books and now speaks with the authority of a scholar. But these are not exceptions. They are symptoms. The problem isn't opinion. It's the inability to see the gaps. Because real knowledge, as it deepens, tends to humble us. The more we learn, the more we realize how much remains unknown. But when we hover at the surface, we mistake the edge for the center. We don't see the depth. We assume we've reached the bottom. And here's the tragic twist. The more convinced someone is of their brilliance, the more resistant they become to correction. That confidence, so admired in our culture, becomes a barrier to growth. Even feedback can't reach them because they don't trust the source, or they distort the message, or they dismiss it entirely. This is the echo chamber of the self, a closed loop where every idea reflects back the illusion of competence. But there's hope, because the very act of recognizing this pattern, of seeing how easy it is to fall into, can break the spell. We begin to question not only what we think we know, but how we came to know it. We get curious again. We soften. We make space for complexity. And in that space, something begins to shift. Not weakness, not doubt that paralyzes, but a deeper kind of intelligence, the kind that doesn't need to be right to feel whole, the kind that listens, that learns, that leaves room for something greater than certainty. There's a quiet dignity in those who carry true knowledge. They don't shout. They don't need to. Their confidence isn't loud. It's grounded. Their wisdom doesn't seek the spotlight. It simply lives in them, like a deep current beneath still water. And perhaps the greatest irony of the human mind is this: the more someone knows, the more aware they become of what they don't know. Not because they're insecure, but because they've walked far enough to see the horizon stretch endlessly beyond them. This is the humility of masters. It's not a performance. It's not false modesty. It's a natural result of proximity to complexity. When you've truly immersed yourself in a subject, lived it, questioned it, failed in it, and returned, you begin to understand how fragile certainty really is. Philosopher Socrates once said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." But this doesn't mean we abandon knowledge. It means we approach it like a sacred responsibility, not a weapon to wield over others. Unlike the novice who clings to absolutes, the master holds space for nuance. Where the beginner says always and never, the master says, "It depends." And in those words is a quiet reverence for context, for change, for the unknown. But here's the paradox. In the world we live in, this kind of wisdom often looks like weakness. We confuse arrogance with authority. We confuse loudness with leadership. We confuse overconfidence with strength. And so, those who truly understand are often overlooked. Their hesitation mistaken for doubt. Their restraint mistaken for timidity. But it's not weakness, it's maturity. Because the master has failed enough to know how little is within their control. They've watched truths evolve, watched certainty dissolve, watched time expose what once felt absolute. And so they don't cling, they listen. This kind of humility is not passive. It's active. It takes courage to admit you're still learning, especially in a culture that rewards fast answers and punishes vulnerability. But the master chooses humility not to appear good, but to stay honest. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow that lives in each of us, the parts we hide, repress, deny. And one of the most dangerous shadows is the illusion of being above mistakes. The belief that we've outgrown ignorance, that we're immune to error. The true master integrates the shadow. They've made peace with not knowing. And this peace gives them power not over others but over themselves. You can feel it when you're around someone like this. They don't dominate the room, but the room changes around them. Not because of how much they speak, but because of how deeply they've listened. And that's the secret. Wisdom doesn't need to prove itself. It just is. So if you find yourself doubting, hesitating, unsure, that might not be a sign you're lost. It might be a sign you're finally seeing the full map. Because the most dangerous minds are not the ones full of questions. They're the ones full of answers too soon. And the wisest voices are often the ones that whisper, "I'm still learning." Scroll long enough and everyone becomes an expert. Nutrition, politics, psychology, trauma, war. The internet has given voice to billions, but it has also blurred the line between informed opinion and uninformed noise. In the digital age, confidence spreads faster than truth. Algorithms don't reward humility. They reward volume, engagement, certainty. The loudest voice rises, not because it's right, but because it triggers something. Agreement, outrage, validation. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect thrives online, amplified by design. It's not that people wake up intending to mislead. Many truly believe they've understood what they've only skimmed. A few YouTube videos, a thread, a study misread or misquoted, and suddenly they speak with the tone of mastery. But what's missing is silence. Not the absence of sound, but the space to think deeply, to reflect, to not answer right away. The kind of silence that lets knowledge settle, that tempers opinion with perspective. We used to have that, before every conversation was public, before every thought was a post, before we measured intelligence by how fast you can speak on camera. We've forgotten that silence was once part of learning, that real insight doesn't scream, it emerges, slowly, after questions, after uncertainty, after sitting with something long enough to feel its weight. Today, doubt is often mistaken for insecurity. The person who pauses before answering seems unsure. The one who says, "I'm not certain," is seen as less credible than the one who speaks in absolutes. But this is a dangerous inversion. True knowledge is rarely immediate, and the internet, for all its access, skips the most crucial part of wisdom, time. We've created a culture where appearing certain is more important than being thoughtful, where engagement metrics drive content creation, not curiosity, where the pressure to say something, anything, outweighs the value of saying something real. And it affects us in ways we don't even see. We become afraid of not having an opinion. We forget how to say, "I need to learn more." We fear being left behind in the conversation, so we pretend to understand. We post, we argue, we react before we've even digested. But here's the truth no one wants to say: you don't have to know everything. You're allowed to be silent, to listen, to not respond right away, to not have an opinion until it's truly yours. Because wisdom isn't measured by how quickly you answer, it's measured by how deeply you understand. And sometimes, understanding means shutting the screen, turning off the noise, sitting with your own mind long enough to hear what's beneath the scroll. Philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." He said that in the 1600s, before TikTok, before Twitter, before the comment section. Imagine what he'd say now. Maybe what we need isn't more content, but more contemplation. Maybe the path back to wisdom begins with rediscovering silence. And maybe the next time we feel the urge to speak quickly and confidently, we pause and ask, am I adding depth or just volume? Some truths don't arrive with a bang. They arrive in a pause, a breath, a moment of honesty so rare it feels like exposure. And maybe the most disarming truth of all is this: I don't know, not as a sign of failure, not as a confession of weakness, but as an invitation to wisdom, because the mind that dares to admit its limits is the one most ready to expand them. The Dunning-Kruger Effect isn't just a concept. It's a mirror, a lens into the ways we perform competence instead of pursuing clarity. It shows up not only in politics or social media, but in our everyday moments, the conversations where we fake confidence, the decisions we defend to avoid shame, the feedback we reject because it stings too close to our illusion of mastery. But the power of recognizing this bias isn't about judging others. It's about reclaiming ourselves. We are all vulnerable to blind spots, to certainty that disguises insecurity, to the ego that flinches at the unknown. And the path out is not more information, it's more humility. Real learning begins not when we speak, but when we're quiet enough to listen, especially to what makes us uncomfortable. When we soften the grip on needing to be right. When we let go of the performance and return to the process. That's when something shifts. When we stop reacting and start reflecting. When we ask better questions, not louder answers. When we measure wisdom not by confidence, but by compassion for ourselves, for our fallibility, for the mystery of it all. Because the truth is, the mind that rushes to conclusions rarely arrives at anything worth knowing. But the one that waits, that hesitates, that listens to silence as much as sound, that mind grows. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "The more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless." Certainty can become a kind of death, a fossilized version of who we were, petrified by fear of change. But not knowing, that's alive. That's breath. That's the mind in motion. We're living in an age of answers, but starving for understanding. Surrounded by voices, but longing for depth. And in that hunger, we forget. Real insight rarely comes fast. It arrives through stillness, through living the questions long enough that they start to reshape us. So when you catch yourself clutching to being right, when you feel the urgency to assert, to dominate, to declare, pause. Ask yourself, is this clarity or is it control? Is this truth or is it protection? Because you are allowed to not know. You are allowed to still be learning. And maybe that's the most honest thing any of us can say. So if this message touched something quiet inside you, write in the comments. I choose to not know. Not because you lack knowledge, but because you have the courage to seek deeper than appearances, to move beyond performance, to walk into uncertainty with your eyes open and your ego silent. Subscribe only if you're ready to trade noise for nuance, speed for depth, certainty for truth. Because the journey isn't to know more than others. It's to know yourself more truly. And that journey always begins with a question. Are you willing to be misunderstood just to stay honest? Are you willing to grow slower in exchange for growing deeper? Because if you are, you've already begun.